Hello and welcome to part 13 of video series on how to use Blender 2.7. In this video, I'm going to be showing you the process of UV mapping, which is basically the process of unwrapping an object that you've modeled so that you can paint the texture in a graphics program like Photoshop or Gimp. We're going to be unwrapping and texturing a very simple object for this video, but this process is perfectly applicable to any model, even something as intricate as a character mesh. But we'll be using a cube because a cube is very simple. It only has 6 faces and therefore will be simpler to unwrap. Now the first part of UV mapping is marking seams. What this basically means is if you can think of your model, in this case our cube, as made of paper. Let's say it's origami. And you want to take that 3D object and lay it flat on the ground, you have to mark seams, which is where you would cut the model in order to lay all the faces, all the polygons down flat on the ground, usually again in a square. So what I'm going to be doing is going into edit mode, so I'll press tab, and in edge select mode I have to select edges on the mesh that I want to mark as seams. These seams are the cut points in which the mesh will separate so that the 3D object can lay flat nicely on the ground, preferably in a somewhat of an organized fashion. So what I would do if I were you is I would follow along with exactly what it is I'm selecting, because the way we're going to be unwrapping this cube is in a way that it'll lay out nicely in a T shape on the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a U of edges on the top of the cube, so forming a capital U. It doesn't matter from which angle you come from, it just means that your T shape when it's laid out flat will be in a different orientation, but we'll talk about that once we get there. So a U shape, I'm actually going to go down and change my viewport shading to wireframe so you can see exactly what's selected. And then from the tops of the U, I'm going to select those 2 edges, and again you can select more than one edge by holding shift down on your keyboard. And so we have a U with 2 edges selected coming down on the Z-axis from that U, and then on the bottom of the cube I'm going to select the 2 edges that are parallel with the sides of the U, so this one and this one. I'm just going to orbit around so you can see what that looks like. Basically it's 3 U's, or a U and 2 C's from this angle. So once you have those edges selected, what you need to do is mark these edges as seams. The way you do that is over here on your tool shelf, and again if you don't have your tool shelf you can click on the little plus or tap T on your keyboard, is we have to find the button that says mark seams. Now ever since Blender 2.7 they've moved some of these things around into categories, and UVs, in fact shading in UVs, is in the 3rd tab when you're in edit mode. The mark seam button is right here, so I'll click on that with those edges selected, and when you click mark seam those edges become red. In fact they're orange now, but if I press A to deselect all, they're just left to be red, and that means that they are marked as seams. The next step is to actually unwrap the mesh. Now we're not actually going to lay out the faces here in the 3D viewport, it's going to stay like a cube, so we need to make another window. So I'm going to drag this little cross-hatched area down to make a second window, and in fact I'm going to divide this window into 2 windows side by side. One of these windows, in fact this one, will be a UV image editor window. Now I don't think I've shown you this window in previous videos in this series, so I'm going to go down to the bottom and change the window type to a UV image editor window. It's in this window that you can lay out UV maps, in other words the location or all the faces in a different location in this square. It's also where you can just open images and bring them into Blender. So it kind of has a few functions. It's basically for image or image mapping and unwrapping. This window, because we're going to be applying a texture, is going to become, you might have guessed it, a node editor window. So I'll change this window to a node editor window. And I don't need the side panel yet, so I'll collapse it. And we're actually not going to apply the material until after we paint it in Photoshop. So we have to unwrap this cube. I'm still in edit mode. If you're not, go back into edit mode, and I'm going to press A to select all. Right now I'm in edge select mode, but that doesn't really matter. I can be in face or vertice. Usually I'm working in faces though. So with everything selected in this window, with my mouse over to the cube, I'm going to press U, which is the UV mapping menu, and I'm going to select unwrap. You can also find that, by the way, in this third tab under the UVs heading, unwrap, and then click on unwrap. When you do that, you're going to see your faces laid out in this square. Now again, mine forms a T. That's just the way that I did it from the orientation that I marked my seams. But yours might be a sideways T, and it'll always fit in that cube by default. In this UV image editor window, you can move, in other words, grab or rotate or scale things in the exact same way as in the 3D viewport. You can tap R to rotate. You can tap R and then type in a number in degrees that you want to rotate. So if I type R, in fact I'll do that again, R and then -90 for -90, I can then press enter and I've rotated it 90 or -90 degrees. I can tap S to scale down, I can tap G to select all, I can right click to select objects, I can even, if I make this a little bit wider, select between the different modes. Vertices select mode, edge select mode, so I can select edges, face select mode, so I can select individual faces, and even island select mode, which selects the entire thing. And again, you right click to select objects, or sub-objects in this case. I want my T to fit nicely in this square, and I think I might just be going over the edge a little bit, so I'm going to scale the whole thing down just a little bit and press G to move it and put it right sort of in the middle. If your T is upside down, that's totally okay too. It's at this point where I want to save my Blender file. So I'm going to go up to File and Save As and go to my desktop, and I'm going to call this letter block, because I'm going to be painting all the different sides of my cubes like a children's block with colors and letters. So I'll click on Save as Blender File. It's at this point where I want to export this layout. Now what this means is this square, we're going to export it as an image file. In our case, a PNG image file, which, unlike a JPEG, can contain transparency. What that allows us to do is have sort of a transparent image that only has lines where these lines of our edges are of our unwrapped model. In Photoshop, what we can do is use those lines to know where all the faces are so we can paint out the texture. So in this window with everything selected, so you can tap A until everything goes orange, I'm going to go down to the UVs menu and I'm going to find Export UV Layout. Now sometimes this menu goes up to the top. In fact, if it gets a little bit taller, there we go. It'll go up. And I'm going to select at the very top Export UV Layout. Now what that does, again, is it saves a PNG file. I'm going to go to my desktop and I'm going to call this image file Cube UV Layout Export. And it's a PNG file, which again lets us have transparency in an image. Before I press Export UV Layout though, what I want to do is down at the bottom of my side panel, it lets me choose my image type. So if you really don't want a PNG, you can select EPS or SVG. I know at least SVG is a vector file, so I'm not going to work with that. You can select the resolution. 1024 by 224 is okay unless you're working with something very, very detailed, like a character. Notice how it's a square, just like our layout. The last thing you need to change is this bottom section. This bottom section called Fill Opacity. By default, it's 0.25. You want it to be at totally 0. So I'll just type 0 in there, and I'll go ahead and press Export UV Layout. So I'm going to do a quick file save, and then I'm going to switch over to the second part of this video, which is going to be in Photoshop. Now, if you're using Gimp, that's totally okay. Even if you're using MS Paint, that's totally okay. The benefit of using a program like Photoshop or Gimp is, well, it's a better tool, and most importantly, there are layers that you can use. I'm going to go to File and Open, and on my desktop, I have my Cube UV Layout Export.png, which I will open. And here's our layout. Now, if you're watching this video in low def, in 360 or 480p, you might not be able to see these lines, so please turn this video up to at least 720p. I have this checkerboard and the lines on top. The checkerboard means transparency. And if you look over here in my layers panel, I have one layer. It's called layer 0, but I'm going to double click on that name and I'm going to call it UV layout. Now, if you know how to lock a layer, and I haven't done this in a long time, you might want to lock that layer. Nope, I totally forget how to do that, so I'm not going to do it. But it wouldn't be a bad idea to lock that layer. What is most important here, though, is I could, if I'm just using a program like Paint, use my Paint Bucket tool, and I could just pick a color, let's say red, and fill in this square. And then pick a different color and fill in the next square, fill in all the squares with different colors, so all the sides of my cube will have a different color. The problem with that, though, is that these black lines exist, and the black lines will show up on your mesh, which you probably don't want. So what I'm going to do instead is I'll undo that fill. I'm going to go below this layer, so I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to drag it below the UV layout layer. I'm going to fill that with a color there, or actually draw a square in there. So when I go to export this texture to another JPEG or PNG file, which I will then bring into Blender, it won't have these black lines. You don't want the black lines on your final product. So in this new layer that I made below UV layout, I'm going to use my marquee tool, my marching ants tool, and I'm going to zoom in on the square, and I'm going to hold down Shift after I start selecting so I get a perfect square. There we go. And I'm going to fill in using my Paint Bucket tool. The first one will be red. There we go. Now that I have a perfect square, all I have to do now is duplicate this layer and move it and change the color. So with this layer selected, I should name it, but I'm not going to. Layer, duplicate layer, OK. And then use my Move tool. Now I'm going very fast. If you're not familiar with Photoshop, you could do the same process in something like MS Paint or a graphics program of your choice. But again, using Photoshop or Gimp, Gimp is a free tool, Photoshop is obviously not, then you'll be able to do something like this with layers. I'm going to change the color of this second cube, or the second square, so I can go up to, with this layer selected, Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation. And hue basically means color, or different value of color. So if I use that, and by the way, the keyboard shortcut for that is Control-U. I can just slide this hue and pick any color that I want. Yellow looks okay. Layer, duplicate layer. Okay, I don't care what I'm naming it. And I'm going to hold Shift while I'm dragging this, so it drags on a straight line. And Control-U, and I'll make this one, sure, why not. I can duplicate the yellow layer again. Duplicate layer. Hold Shift so it drags down in a straight line. And Control-U, and I'll make this one a blue color. Sure, why not. And layer, duplicate layer. Control-U. Let's make this one a greeny color. Sure. And layer, duplicate layer. And I'll move this one down, holding the Shift key down. I'll zoom in to make sure I don't get any gap there. And Control-U, and I want this one to be sort of an aqua color. There we go. So I have all my colored sides. I'm going to do one last thing though. I'm going to make a new layer above the colored layers, and I'm going to paint in white letters A, B, C, D, E, F. So using my paintbrush tool, that's an okay size or brush, I'm just going to paint really bad looking letters. Obviously, if you're texturing something that's supposed to be photorealistic, you could even use textures from a website like cdtextures.com. You could pull out all of your bag of tricks that you know how to do with Photoshop or Gimp to make the texture that you want to use. You can use things like the burn and dodge tool, your paint brush tool, your gradient tool. Oops, I made 2 Ds in a row. That's embarrassing. E and F. Okay. I'm going to do a Control or Command S to save, and because we opened a PNG, and because we now have layers, Photoshop wants me to save a PSD, a Photoshop document file, which Blender will not open, but that's okay. We'll do another export. So I'm going to go to Save, and press OK. So now we have a Photoshop document. That's great. If I want to come back later and make a change to one of the layers, that's fine. But now I'm going to go to File and Save As and save a PNG. I forgot one step though. I want to hide this UV layout lines. I don't want that in my exported texture PNG or JPEG file. So I'm going to go to File and Save As. We're saving the one that's actually going to go onto the cube. So I'm going to change the format to PNG. Now PNGs can have transparency, so this part actually might be transparent with checkerboard, but they don't have to. It's just a lossless. That means it doesn't get all pixely, or it doesn't get artifacts like JPEGs do. I'm going to call this Cube Diffuse Texture, and I'll click Save and press OK. Okay, so I'm going to switch back over to Blender. Now, if you watched my UV mapping tutorial in the Blender 2.6 video series that I made a couple of years ago, you'll know that at this point I had to open the image texture that I just made in Photoshop right here and kind of overlap it with this UV layout. Well, in Cycles, that process, or this whole process, is actually much easier. I don't have to do that. I only have to bring in the image texture once because we're just applying a material on this object. So I'm actually going to just go back into object mode with the tab key, and right now I'm in wireframe mode. So I'm going to switch back over to solid view, and I want to add a material to this cube. Now, a little known fact is that when you start up Blender, the default cube, which is what I'm working with, actually has material on it by default. It has a material called material. I'm going to rename that material to cube texture, and we want to use nodes, so you can click this use nodes button right there, or you can click use nodes there, it doesn't matter. And there we have our texture or material that's on the cube. It has a diffuse BSDF shader and a material output. We want to add a image texture node, so I'll press Shift A, go to the texture section, add an image texture node, and now we want to open the image that we just created. Again, we have to select the PNG file that we made, Cube Diffuse Texture. I don't believe Photoshop accepts PSD Photoshop files. So Cube Diffuse Texture.png, open, and the last step is to connect the output color of the texture and attach it to the diffuse material. And we're done. Except it doesn't show up on the cube. Why isn't it showing up? Because we have to change the viewport shading of this window over from solid, which again does not show materials, over to, does material do it? Yes, it does. Material will show the image texture on there. There we have it, our textured cube. Now, the last thing I kind of want to say before we do a little bit of an extra in this video is some of these letters are backwards. The E is backwards. I think that's the only one that's backwards in mine. The reason why that happened is if I go back into edit mode and look at my unwrapping, in fact, what I'm going to do is open the image on top of this. So the way you can do that is you don't have to open the image again in Blender. It's already been brought into Blender. So with this little image icon, if I click it, it gives me a list of all the images I've seen before in Blender since I've opened it. And there it is right there. So if I zoom out again, I don't know why it zooms in. You can see the map over top of the image texture. And if you think about the way that this folded open, you'll realize that this E actually should be facing the other way. So that's why it might not be a good idea to have the cube unwrapped in all in one piece. So not necessarily a T, but just maybe two rectangular sections. It's up to you. That'll be some experimentation on your part to figure out how to best unwrap your object. So that's going to be it for this video as far as basic UV mapping. The last thing I want to say and do is make this cube a little bit rounded. Now normally you would finish modeling an object before you unwrap it, but I want to make this cube a little bit rounded on all the edges. So what I'm going to do is in object mode, so I can close this image and press tab to go back into object mode, is I'm going to add the modifier subdivision surface. And again, that rounds out the object. I can change my number of subdivisions up to 2, and I'm going to click on smooth shading. I don't want it to be a ball like it is right now though. I want it to just be a cube but have rounded edges. So in edit mode, so I'll press tab to go back into edit mode, I still have access to all of my original sides. What I'm going to do is select all the sides with the A key, and I'm going to subdivide this cube up. So I'll press W to bring up my specials menu, or I could go to my tools tab in my tool shelf, and I could select subdivide, and I'm going to go down to the subdivide section, just like in one of our previous videos when I made a character's head or a cartoon character's head. I'm going to change the number of cuts up to 2. So now if I go back into object mode, you'll see that the cube has rounded corners, but the images still work. And the reason why the images didn't get all messed up, the texture is still working, is if you look at the map up here in the UV image editor window, the T is in the exact same spot. If I open up that image again and show you what it looks like, we subdivided up the cube, but the cube didn't move. In fact, none of the faces moved, they just got subdivided up. And the UV image, or the subsurf modifier, it just took the mesh as it was and rounded it out, but the UVs were applied first, so that's not going to mess it up either. What will mess up your UV map is if you try to add things or change things or merge things together or move this map at all. If I select all of the vertices, actually doesn't matter which, by the way, you can orbit in any header bar to scroll it side to side by dragging your mouse, just like orbiting, and you can see the different kind of things that are available to you. I'm going to grab everything in this and move it around, and you can see that if I move the UV map, it no longer knows where to put the image texture. In fact, you can see that if I move it way off, it starts looking really messy. This UV map area actually tiles. So if I kind of move this T over here, you can see that the image texture is almost the way that it should be, because this T will repeat again and again in all directions. Just like that. Okay, but make sure that you don't move it in most cases. There we go. But that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.